You're listening to Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk. Each week, your host, Polly Requa, interviews veterinarians and individuals in the pet industry from across the nation answering pet questions. Bark and Wag podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes can be found at barkandwag.com under the podcast tab. That's BARKNWAG.com. Please remember to subscribe to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk.
Thank you for listening to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk. Bark and Wag is dedicated to protecting our dogs through advocacy, education, and supporting like-minded dog lovers by selling custom pet products. Bark and Wag is excited to announce our new partnership with a Colorado hemp farm to produce a line of CBD products for your pets. Bark and Wag has CBD pet tincture available in 300, 750, 1200, and 2400 milligrams. Bark and Wag CBD is pet safe, no THC, it's made in the USA, and is CO2 extracted. Please check out Bark and Wag's website, barkandwag.com. That is BARK, to see our line of CBD and awesome merchandise. We love pooch ideas for podcasts and merchandise, so anytime send an email to Polly at barkandwag.com with your suggestions.
Welcome to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk. I'm your host, Polly Requa. Today we're talking to Dr. Laura Brown, owner of Green Tree Veterinarian Clinic in Libertyville, Illinois. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Brown.
Hey, Polly. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to find out, due to living in Colorado, a lot of people take their dogs on long hikes. And in some hiking chat groups, there's been a lot of banter back and forth about when you really should take your dog on a long hike. And so I wanted to find out, at what age could you start running and doing long hikes and walks with your puppy?
With a puppy. So as a general statement, I'm going to say 6 months of age. And the reason I'm going to say that is, depending on the dog breed, around 6 months is when all the dog's growth plates are closed. So the growth plates are the places in the bones where they get longer from. And those are still, your dog's still growing and getting bigger by length and bone growth until about 6 months. Granted, they grow bigger after that, but usually their growth plates are not going to be as sensitive to injury after that point. That, I will say, a caveat on that is like a really large breed dog, like a Great Dane.
Okay.
If you think about it, technically dogs are puppies until they're a year old, right? Like that's how long we feed them puppy food, and they grow, but they grow their fastest and their biggest and their most changes from up until about 6-7 months. And then they kind of slow down and level off, but they still grow another 6 months, right? So
yeah,
it's the younger puppies that their growth, you could injure their growth plates when they're in the midst of getting longer bones. And so the other thing I tell people here in Illinois too, even though we don't have the change in altitude and the rigorousness, is you don't want to take your puppy out on a long run like you're training them for a marathon. I mean, they have to get, they need to train just like everybody else to get cardiovascular endurance and muscle endurance and things like that. So, let the puppy sort of dictate what they want to do. And if you take them on a walk and they they usually lap you a couple times because they're all over the place. They're running back and forth. And, when you take them to like a dog park, they can run and run and run, but you aren't going to stay out there for like 6 hours.
Yeah.
In a puppy. Now, when you go on a hike, you might, right? Like it might take you all day. So that's just maybe common sense to not do that on a really young, not fit, not grown up puppy.
Well, and I've always heard a lot of people take their dogs on, a big thing in Colorado are doing 13ers and 14ers. So it's at 14,000 feet. And a lot of dog owners will say, don't do it until they're over a year. I mean, because that's
for
like
their
8 hour.
For their cardiorespiratory part or for their bones? Do you know?
I think it was for more of their muscles.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long hike.
Yeah, that's high up there. I mean, you guys are more used to the altitude but think about us Midwesterners that come in there to ski. Like we get altitude sickness pretty fast, pretty quick, unless you acclimate. But at the same time, you guys live out there, so you're pretty acclimated. I have a friend who lives in Keystone, a veterinarian who lives in Keystone, and she has 2 Frenchies. And, they're the brachycephalic breed, like pugs. They got small nostrils and they're, snorkely. And we went out there in the fall and hiked with them. And those guys were like amazing. I'm like, how do they do this? I'm like dying. But they live out there. So they're acclimated to that altitude. Yeah. And so they did fine. I mean, we couldn't go for 6 hours. You know what I mean? We did, but the other thing about the small dogs too, and I noticed some of the other people who had their dogs out there, if they're small enough, you can pick them up and put them in a backpack and carry them like a kid.
Yeah, we have a pack for our pug.
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of, like, in answer to your question about the puppy thing, like they just need to get more adult parts, whether it's their heart and lungs. They just need to get conditioned to do that. You just can't go from 0 to 60.
Yeah, and I think it's more of these people that don't understand that doing these long hikes the paws start to bleed. I mean, there's a lot of and the dog becomes exhausted. We did a 14er with Maddie, and she had trouble being at the top of the mountain and then coming down. There was a temperature change. And I thought she was going to stroke out.
Was she just panting a bunch, like really hard panting and dragging?
She was definitely panting a lot. It was kind of scary.
Yeah. How long was that whole event?
Well, I mean, it probably 7 hours. I mean,
yeah, that's a long day. Like you drive up there. Is that what you do? Is you drive up there and get out of the car and then do the hike and then drive back down? Or
you park at the base of the mountain and then you hike up.
Oh, yeah.
And then you go down. And so
that's pretty strenuous for anybody.
Yeah, it was.
You know what I mean? So unless you have conditioned yourself and your dog a little at a time, to get, I think that just you have to be careful, even if you're in the bestest of shape,
Well, that's what happens to people too, as you start to, like, people need to know what their level is and be able to turn around.
Yeah.
I mean,
and
Maddie didn't have and Maddie didn't have a problem until we were coming down and there was that temperature change, because at the base of top of the mountain, Amanda was starting to get the chills, and I mean, we had to start getting down.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's valid, even if they're acclimated, right? It's just such a dramatic change. I had somebody ask me, one of my clients was going to Colorado and taking their dog. And I can't remember why she asked me, but she asked me if dogs get altitude sickness. And I kind of giggled because I said, no, I don't think so. But I do think that that might be a good question for one of your Colorado vets.
I think they do. I think dogs can definitely, it comes out in different signs than what a human would go through, but definitely exhaustion, dehydration. A lot of people hike with this, it's almost like a sling.
Yeah.
Just in case, because when you get to the top and you're above tree line, there's no one's carrying your dog down.
Right. Right.
Like it's, and if you're pretty much on your own.
Yeah.
So I think I was just kind of interested because I've just heard, like, you shouldn't neuter your dogs until they're a year. And so I didn't know what the muscle mass
I would say
on a dog.
Yeah, for that extremeness, I would, a year probably makes more sense depending on what size. Like if you have a Labrador that's, going to be a big Labrador and they're going to get from, at 6 months, they weigh 55 pounds, but they're going to turn out to be 100-pound dogs. They got room. They got time. They need time to develop that. But if they're, they're a Sheltie that at 6 months is only going to gain another 5-10 pounds till they get to their adult weight, that's a different story. And I think, to your point, altitude sickness, like in me, is usually a headache. and nausea, like maybe you wouldn't know if your dog had that because you can't,
Right.
who knows when your dog's, well, unless they're vomiting, but you don't know if your dog has a headache.
Right.
So I think it just kind of the same thing that you do for yourself to get your, not pushing yourself. And you wouldn't take your little kid up 14,000 feet without, you know what I mean? They'd be on your back. They wouldn't be able to walk. So think of it like that with young animals. You wouldn't send them up the mountain in that extreme.
There's just a lot of uneducated dog owners. So I just wanted to, get a perspective on.
Sure. Yeah, I do think that's a great question for your Colorado vets, though.
Okay, well, thanks for being on the podcast, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, www.barkandwag.com, to your friends and other pet owners. Have a pressing question for a veterinarian? Ask your question at barkandwag.com under the podcast tab. This has been a KFR production. Join us next time for another edition of Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk.